In this lesson, we will look at refactoring our charity registration application. Here's what we'll do. We will transition from our manual JDBC JPA to Spring Data JPA. We will be introducing repository interfaces for charity repository, for instance. We will eliminate the boilerplate EntityManager code, and we will use @query for complex joins. And we do all this for improved readability, maintainability, and testability. This is what the JPA repository architecture looks like. We have our API controllers that in turn talks to the service layer. These in turn talk to the repository and entities, and these are mapped to our tables. Another view, Spring Data JPA. This is the abstraction layer on top of JPA to reduce the amount of boilerplate code required to implement the DAO. JPA is a specification that facilitates object relational mapping to manage relational data in Java application. And then at the bottom we have Hibernate as a JPA implementation, and this generates the SQL queries and executes using JDBC. This is the repository entity manager view. We have the repository and we have the entity manager. So these are all the methods of the JPA repository interface, and we will use some of them. And then we can add query methods in our repository interface that is defined by ourselves. We have our entity manager. We have a typed query. Now we go over to Eclipse, and first we look at setting up the database again. So we have our MariaDB connection, and we have our JDBC connection properties, and we have our driver definition. Now we have our database creation script. So we create a charity database, then we create a user for our web app, and we grant all the privileges for the web app. Then we set up our user administration table. So here is the creation, and here is our seeding of our users that were previously stored in our in-memory hash map. Here we set the privileges and we confirm. Here we create the charity table. Here we create the category table. Here we insert our category values. We have a many-to-many join between category and charity. Here we create our program table. Here we seed our charity programs. Then we have another many-to-many join table. Then we look at all our created data. We create some charities here, and then we map our charities to categories that we've just inserted. And we create another charity. We create some more mapping, and here we list our charity names and category name relationships. And here we create our registration database and our file attachment table. Actually, yeah, we create our charity registration table and our file attachment table. We allow the web app user to manipulate it, and we set up the insertion of a couple of registrations by our 3 users and their file attachment. Now we are going to run our SQL script. First, we make sure that we are connected with our JDBC connector using MariaDB and our charity database. So right-click, execute all. And we're done. And we can look at our result sets. Before we run our Spring JPA charity registration app, let's just quickly review our configurations. We have a Bootstrap web application initializer with our root context, our servlet context, our REST context, our SOAP context, our logging filter, and our authentication filter. Here is our root context, getting the driver, then the local entity manager bean, getting our Hibernate dialect. We also have a JPA transaction manager and our message source for our internationalization messages, and associated to that is our local validator factory bean, and then our object mapper for classes, and our JackSpeed2 marshaller, and our task scheduler and thread pool scheduler. So here is an implementation of our user admin repository, which previously was a map stored in memory. So extends JPA repository, and then we have our Hibernate query language and get password and find user by name. If we look at get password for user and open call hierarchy, we go to authenticate, and we see now we have a temporary authentication service which implements the authentication service and returns a new user admin principal. And here is our authentication service, username and password. So this is the login that now uses the back-end MariaDB database. We also have our default registration service that implements a registration service, and this in turn calls the repository JPA to get a registration, to get all registration, to save a registration, and to delete a registration. And here is the registration repository, and we see it implements the JPA repository and also the registration repository interface. And this is our interface definition. And this is the JPA repository provided for us by the Spring framework. Now let's compile and run our application. We do a Maven clean install. Everything is built. We do a project clean. We look at our servers. We clean it out. We say run as, run on server. Finish. And it brings up the login screen. We'll use one of the 3 users stored in our database. And here we see the 3 registrations that we loaded in via our database script. And we can create one more. Submit. And there is our 4th registration. And there it is. We have a working Spring JPA with MVC application. And that concludes this tutorial. I will see you in the next one.